March 1943. Columbia University, New York City. A 33-year-old mathematician named Abraham Wald sits in an office on the 4th floor of Hamilton Hall, looking at photographs of bullet holes. The photographs show B-17 flying fortresses that returned from bombing missions over Europe. Wings riddled with damage. Fuselages torn by shrapnel. Tail sections perforated by machine gun fire. The United States Army Air Forces has a problem. 1 in 4 bombers sent over Germany never comes back. The loss rate is unsustainable. At this pace, the entire strategic bombing campaign will collapse within 18 months. Not from lack of aircraft. Not from lack of crews. From mathematics. Every mission costs between 100 and 150 bombers. Every bomber carries 10 men. Every loss is 10 families receiving telegrams. The military needs a solution. They need to make bombers more survivable. The answer seems obvious. Add armor where the damage appears. The Statistical Research Group has been assembled in secret at Columbia University. Mathematicians pulled from academia to solve military problems. Wald is among them. He fled Austria in 1938, one step ahead of the Anschluss. His parents stayed behind. They would not survive the war. Now he sits in New York, examining damage patterns on aircraft that managed to return. The pattern is clear. Bullet holes cluster in specific areas. Wings. Rear fuselage. Horizontal stabilizers. The military's conclusion is logical. Reinforce these areas. Add armor plating where the damage concentrates. Reduce vulnerability where bullets strike most frequently. Wald looks at the photographs. He does not speak for several minutes. The other mathematicians wait. Wald's reputation precedes him. In Vienna, he proved theorems that other mathematicians considered impossible. He sees patterns where others see chaos. He understands probability in ways that feel almost supernatural. The Air Force officers present their data. They have examined 587 bombers that returned from missions over Germany in the past 6 weeks. They have mapped every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every indication of enemy fire. The damage distribution is not random. Certain areas are hit far more frequently than others. The recommendation is clear. Reinforce the wings, the fuselage, the tail. These are the vulnerable areas. These are where bombers are being shot to pieces. Add 200 pounds of armor plate to each aircraft. Distribute it where the damage appears. Protect the areas most frequently hit. Wald raises his hand. He speaks English with a thick Austrian accent. His words are careful, precise. He asks a question that will change the war. Where are the holes on the planes that did not return? Silence in the room. The question hangs in the air like smoke. The officers look at each other. One colonel clears his throat. He explains that they don't have data on aircraft that were shot down. Those planes are in occupied Europe, behind enemy lines, in German scrap yards or scattered across French fields. Wald nods slowly. He explains his reasoning. The pattern of damage on returning aircraft is not random, but it is also not revealing vulnerability. It is revealing invulnerability. The bombers they are examining survived their missions. The areas showing bullet damage are the areas where a bomber can absorb hits and still fly. The areas showing no damage are the critical zones. Those are the places where a single hit brings a plane down. The engines, the cockpit, the fuel tanks, the bomb bays. When bullets strike these areas, the aircraft never makes it home. It never appears in the data set. It never gets photographed. This is survivor bias. The fundamental error of examining only successes while ignoring failures. The military is looking at planes that lived and asking what made them vulnerable. They should be looking at planes that lived and asking what kept them alive. The Air Force officers are skeptical. One general argues that the data is clear. The wings show heavy damage. Therefore wings need armor. Another officer points to the concentration of hits on the rear fuselage. These areas are obviously vulnerable to enemy fire. Wald draws a diagram on the blackboard. A simplified B-17. He marks the areas showing damage in the photographs. Then he marks the areas showing no damage. He explains that German fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners are not aiming for wings. They are aiming for critical systems. When they hit wings, the bomber survives. When they hit engines or cockpits, the bomber does not. The implication is profound. Every decision about aircraft armor has been backwards. The military has been reinforcing areas that can sustain damage while leaving critical areas exposed. They have been looking at evidence and reaching exactly the wrong conclusion. Not everyone in the room understands immediately. Some officers continue arguing for reinforcing damaged areas. The photographs are compelling. Bullet holes are visible. The damage is real. How can areas with no damage be the vulnerable ones? Wald explains it another way. Imagine examining only soldiers who survived combat. You notice they all have leg wounds, arm wounds, shoulder wounds. You conclude these are the most dangerous injuries. But you never see the soldiers with head wounds or chest wounds. Those soldiers are in graves, not hospitals. The room falls silent again. This time the silence is different. Understanding is spreading. The officers begin to see what Wald sees. The absence of data is itself data. The planes they are not examining are the ones that matter most. One captain asks the critical question: how much weight can a bomber carry? Armor is heavy. If they reinforce everything, the aircraft cannot fly. Choices must be made. Every pound of armor means one less pound of bombs or fuel. Wald already has the calculations ready. He has been running numbers for weeks. The solution is precise. Concentrate armor on engines, cockpits, fuel systems. Leave wings and fuselage sections relatively unprotected. Counterintuitive. Opposite of what the visual evidence suggests. But mathematically sound. April 1943. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Army Air Forces engineers receive Wald's recommendations. They are not enthusiastic. The proposal contradicts everything they have observed. They have seen bombers return with wings shot full of holes. They have seen tail sections barely attached. These planes made it home. Clearly these areas can withstand damage. The head of aircraft armor development is a man named Colonel James Harrison. He spent 3 years designing protective systems for military vehicles. His entire career is built on the principle of reinforcing areas that show damage. Now a civilian mathematician is telling him to do the opposite. Harrison orders tests. They mount armor plating on mock-ups of B-17 critical sections. They fire .50 caliber machine guns at engine housings, fuel tanks, cockpit areas. The results are unsettling. Single hits to engines cause catastrophic failure. Hits to fuel tanks create fires. Hits to cockpits kill pilots instantly. Meanwhile they test wing sections. They fire hundreds of rounds through aluminum wing surfaces. The wings absorb incredible punishment. Bullets pass through without causing structural failure. A wing can lose 30% of its surface area and still generate lift. This is why bombers return with perforated wings. Wings can fail gradually. Engines fail immediately. By May 1943, Harrison is convinced. He authorizes the installation of additional armor on B-17s and B-24s. Not where damage appears but where damage never appears. Engine cowlings receive reinforced plating. Cockpit areas get armored glass and steel plates. Fuel tanks are relocated to less exposed positions. The changes add 250 pounds to each aircraft. This is acceptable. The Air Force is willing to sacrifice some bomb load for crew survival. The modifications begin in June 1943. It will take 6 months to retrofit the existing bomber fleet. New bombers roll off assembly lines with Wald specifications already incorporated. Not everyone agrees with the changes. Some pilots complain that armored cockpits reduce visibility. Some bombardiers argue that relocated fuel tanks disrupt weight distribution. Some ground crews dislike the extra maintenance required for shielded engine components. But Wald's mathematics are difficult to argue against. His calculations are peer-reviewed by other members of the Statistical Research Group. Every mathematician reaches the same conclusion. The survivor bias is real. The visual evidence is misleading. The counterintuitive solution is correct. July 1943. The 8th Air Force begins flying modified B-17s on missions over occupied Europe. The initial results are difficult to interpret. Loss rates do not immediately decline. Some missions still see 15 to 20% losses. Other missions lose fewer than 5%. The variability makes analysis difficult. But something is changing. Crews are noticing differences. Pilots report that engine hits no longer cause immediate power losses frequently. When engines are hit, the damage is less catastrophic. Aircraft can maintain altitude long enough to reach friendly territory. This is critical. A bomber that crashes in England is a loss of aircraft but not a loss of crew. August 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. 376 bombers attack ball bearing factories deep in Germany. German fighters meet them 50 miles from the target. The battle lasts for hours. 60 bombers are shot down. The loss rate is 16%. This is catastrophic but not unprecedented. What is different is the nature of the losses. Analysts examine after-action reports. Most destroyed bombers were hit in engines or cockpits. Very few were shot down due to wing damage or fuselage hits. The vulnerable areas that Wald identified are proving to be as critical as his mathematics predicted. Conversely, many bombers return with extensive wing damage that would previously have been considered catastrophic. One B-17 lands with an 8-foot section of its left wing missing. The pilot reports that control was difficult but possible. The bomber is repaired and returns to service within 2 weeks. September 1943. Colonel Harrison writes a report summarizing the armor modifications. Loss rates are down 7% compared to pre-modification missions. This translates to approximately 35 fewer bombers lost per 500 aircraft mission. Over the course of a year, this means 840 aircraft saved. 8,400 crewmen who will return home. But the transformation goes beyond armor placement. Wald's insight about survivor bias begins to spread through military planning. Analysts start questioning other assumptions based on incomplete data. Training programs are re-evaluated. Tactics are reassessed. Every decision based on examining only survivors is now suspect. October 1943. The Statistical Research Group expands its work. They examine bomber formation tactics. Current doctrine calls for tight formations to concentrate defensive firepower. But tight formations make it easier for German fighters to attack multiple bombers simultaneously. The data from returning bombers shows heavy damage from beam attacks. Wald applies the same logic. What about bombers that did not return? After analyzing mission reports, he determines that most losses occur when formations break up under attack. Stragglers are vulnerable. Isolated bombers have no mutual support. The solution is not tighter formations but better discipline to maintain formation integrity under fire. This recommendation is harder to implement than armor changes. It requires training, not engineering. It requires discipline under stress. It requires crew confidence in formation tactics even when every instinct says to break away and run for home. November 1943. German fighter tactics evolve. Luftwaffe pilots notice the increased armor on American bombers. They adjust their attack patterns. Instead of targeting engines from the sides, they begin frontal attacks. They aim for cockpits. They exploit the fact that frontal armor is thinner than side armor. This creates a new problem. Frontal attacks are difficult to defend against. The bomber's forward-firing guns are limited. Tail gunners cannot help. Ball turret gunners have restricted angles. The Germans are exploiting a vulnerability that Wald's modifications did not fully address. The Army Air Forces responds by developing long-range fighter escorts. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks can now accompany bombers deep into Germany. The fighters break up German frontal attacks before they develop. This is a tactical solution to a problem that armor alone cannot solve. December 1943. Wald publishes a classified report titled, A Method of Estimating Plane Vulnerability Based on Damage of Survivors. The report is 75 pages of mathematical proofs and statistical analysis. Most military officers cannot follow the mathematics. But the conclusions are clear and the results speak for themselves. By the end of 1943, bomber loss rates have declined from 25% to 18%. This is still horrifically high. Nearly 1 in 5 bombers sent over Germany fails to return. But it is an improvement. Thousands of crewmen owe their lives to equations written on a blackboard in New York. January 1944. The concept of survivor bias begins appearing in training manuals. Not the mathematics behind it but the principle. Young navigators and bombardiers are taught to question assumptions based on incomplete evidence. They are told that what they see is not always what matters. This lesson extends beyond aircraft armor. Gunners are taught not to aim at enemy fighters they can clearly see. Instead, they are taught to aim at the empty spaces where fighters will be when bullets arrive. It is the same logic. What is visible is less important than what is predictable. February 1944. Wald begins working on a new problem, determining optimal bombing altitudes. The Air Force has been bombing from 25,000 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire. But accuracy suffers at high altitude. Some officers advocate lower altitude attacks for better precision. Wald examines bombers that returned from low-altitude missions. They show heavy damage. The recommendation from field commanders is to avoid low-altitude bombing. Wald asks his signature question. What about the bombers that did not return from low-altitude missions? The analysis is complex. Low-altitude bombing is more accurate but more dangerous. High-altitude bombing is safer but less accurate. The optimal solution depends on target priority. For heavily defended targets, high altitude is better despite reduced accuracy. For lightly defended targets, low altitude is acceptable. This is not the answer military planners want. They want simple rules. Bomb at this altitude under these conditions. But Wald's mathematics reveal that optimal decisions depend on context. There are no universal solutions. Every mission requires calculation. March 1944. The heavy bomber offensive against Germany intensifies. Missions of 1,000 bombers become routine. The loss rates remain around 15 to 18%. This is sustainable but barely. The Air Force is replacing losses but cannot expand rapidly. Every bomber shot down slows the strategic campaign. April 1944. 9,000 B-17s and B-24s are now flying with modified armor configurations based on Wald's recommendations. The changes have become standard. New crews do not know that the armor placement was once controversial. They accept it as obvious. This is how truth becomes conventional wisdom. The consequences of Wald's insight extend far beyond armor plating. The fundamental principle, that survivors tell an incomplete story, begins to reshape how the military thinks about evidence. Intelligence analysts start questioning reports based only on captured enemy documents. What about the documents that were destroyed? What do they reveal through absence? May 1944. The 8th Air Force over Germany. A B-17 named Lucky Strike, takes a 20mm cannon hit to the No. 3 engine during a mission to Magdeburg. The engine catches fire. Pilot Lieutenant Robert Fraser shuts down fuel flow and activates the fire suppression system. The fire goes out. The armored engine cowling contains the damage. The bomber maintains formation and continues to target. Before Wald's modifications, this hit would likely have caused catastrophic engine failure, fire spreading to the wing fuel tanks, and loss of the aircraft. Instead, the bomber completes its mission, drops its bombs and returns to base. 9 men go to dinner that night instead of dying over Germany. Fraser will never know that his survival was the result of a mathematician's insight 2 years earlier. He will never meet Abraham Wald. He will file a damage report that becomes one more data point. One more example of armor working as designed. One more survivor. The accumulated effect of thousands of such moments changes the air war. German fighter pilots notice that American bombers have become harder to kill. Hits that once brought immediate results now require sustained attacks. This increases German pilot exposure to defensive fire. Luftwaffe loss rates begin to climb. June 1944. D-Day. Allied bombers provide air support for the invasion of Normandy. The loss rate for these missions is 3%. This is remarkably low. Multiple factors contribute: fighter escorts, German Air Force depletion, tactical surprise. But survivability improvements from Wald's armor modifications play a role that cannot be separated from other factors. After the invasion, bomber missions shift focus. Less strategic bombing of German industry, more tactical bombing of transportation networks and troop concentrations. These missions fly at lower altitudes where accuracy improves. The increased vulnerability to ground fire is partially offset by improved armor protection. July 1944. The Statistical Research Group analyzes 6 months of mission data comparing pre-modification and post-modification loss rates. The conclusion is clear. For missions where aircraft take damage but survive, the survival rate has increased by 12%. This means that of 100 bombers that receive hits, 12 more now make it home. That number seems small. 12%. But over 300,000 bomber sorties flown from 1943 to 1945, 12% represents 36,000 aircraft that survived damage which would previously have destroyed them. At 10 crew members per aircraft, that is 360,000 young men who lived instead of died. Not all of these lives can be attributed solely to Wald's recommendations. Other factors matter. Fighter escorts, improved tactics, German industrial decline. But Wald's contribution is measurable and significant. His mathematics saved lives at scale. August 1944. Paris is liberated. Allied bombers continue striking German oil refineries and transportation hubs. The Luftwaffe is increasingly desperate. German pilots begin ramming bombers when ammunition runs out. These suicide attacks focus on cockpits and engines. Wald's modifications save some crews from ramming attacks, but not all. September 1944. Lieutenant James Morrison's B-24 takes a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over Munich. The shell penetrates the bomb bay and detonates. The explosion tears through the aircraft. Morrison manages to keep the bomber airborne long enough for 7 of his 10 crew members to bail out. He and 2 others die in the crash. Wald will read Morrison's casualty report months later. He will note that the bomb bay had minimal armor due to weight constraints. He will calculate whether additional protection would have prevented the loss. The mathematics suggest probably not. Some hits are unsurvivable regardless of armor. This is the limit of what probability can prevent. October 1944. Germany's war industries are collapsing. Fuel shortages ground much of the Luftwaffe. Anti-aircraft ammunition production declines. American bomber losses drop to 10% per mission. The air war is being won, but the cost remains brutal. 10% loss rate means 1 in 10 bombers does not return. 100 men per 1,000 bomber mission. November 1944. Wald receives a letter from a B-17 pilot named Captain Edward Thompson. Thompson's aircraft was hit by flak over Berlin. Engine fire. The armored cowling contained the blaze long enough for the crew to extinguish it. Thompson writes that he learned the armor placement was designed by a civilian mathematician. He wants to express thanks. Wald does not respond to the letter. He does not keep personal correspondence from servicemen. His work is classified. He does not discuss it outside secure facilities. But he keeps Thompson's letter in his desk drawer. One piece of evidence that mathematics can save lives. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. German forces launch a surprise offensive in Belgium. Allied air support is limited by winter weather. When skies clear, bombers strike German columns. The missions fly at low altitude for accuracy. Loss rates spike to 15%. But without Wald's armor improvements, losses would likely have been 20% or higher. January 1945. The final months of the air war over Germany. Cities are burning. Industry is destroyed. Transportation networks are shattered. German civilians are dying in numbers that make pre-war bombing campaigns seem surgical by comparison. The moral weight of the strategic bombing campaign is something that survivors will debate for generations. Wald does not participate in debates about bombing ethics. His role is statistical analysis, not moral philosophy. He calculates probabilities, not justifications. When the war ends, he will return to pure mathematics. But the consequences of his work will remain visible in every bomber that survived because of where armor was placed. February 1945. Dresden firebombing. Allied bombers create a firestorm that kills tens of thousands of civilians. The loss rate for bomber crews is 2%. The low losses are due to minimal German defenses, not improved armor. But every crew that survives in part because of accumulated protective improvements. March 1945. The end approaches. German cities are rubble. The Luftwaffe is essentially destroyed. Bomber missions face minimal opposition. Loss rates drop below 5%. The air war is won. But the victory cost 80,000 Allied airmen killed and 28,000 aircraft destroyed. Wald's modifications could not prevent all these losses. Many resulted from factors beyond armor protection. Structural failure, mid-air collisions, navigation errors, mechanical failures. But Wald's insight about survivor bias saved thousands. His mathematics turned invisible evidence into actionable knowledge. April 1945. Germany surrenders. The bombing campaign ends. Abraham Wald's work becomes less immediately relevant. The Statistical Research Group begins to dissolve. Mathematicians return to universities. The classified reports they produced will remain secret for decades. But the principle Wald identified will outlive the war. Survivor bias will be taught in statistics courses, business schools, medical research programs. The insight that the absent data matters as much as the visible data will become fundamental to modern analytical thinking. May 1945. Victory in Europe. Bomber crews celebrate in England, France, Italy. They toast survival. They remember friends who did not return. They do not know that many of them survived because a mathematician asked a simple question. Where are the holes in the planes that did not come back? June 1945. The war shifts to the Pacific. B-29 bombers attack Japan. These aircraft were designed after Wald's recommendations became standard. Their armor placement reflects his analysis. Losses over Japan are high due to Japanese fighter tactics and anti-aircraft fire, but survivability is better than it would have been. July 1945. The atomic bombs end the war. Strategic bombing becomes history. Abraham Wald returns to teaching at Columbia University. He publishes papers on statistical theory. He does not discuss his war work. It remains classified. The bombers return home. Some are scrapped. Some are preserved in museums. The bullet holes in their wings and fuselages tell a story, but it is an incomplete story. The holes that are not there tell a deeper truth. The absence of damage in critical areas is evidence of design based on understanding what matters. August 1945. A final accounting. The U.S. 8th Air Force flew 365,514 bomber sorties over Europe from 1942 to 1945. They lost 18,418 aircraft and 46,500 crewmen killed. Every number represents a name, a family, a life ended. The war ends, but the mathematics do not. Wald's insight about survivor bias becomes foundational to modern statistical analysis. In every field where evidence is incomplete, where data comes only from survivors, where absence carries meaning, his question echoes. What about the cases we are not seeing? Medical research learns this lesson. Clinical trials that examine only patients who complete treatment miss critical data about why patients drop out. Effective drugs can appear ineffective if the sickest patients die before treatment completes. The survivors in the data set are not representative of all patients. Business analysis learns this lesson. Companies study successful firms and identify common practices. But failed companies that followed the same practices are not examined because they no longer exist. The visible evidence of success is misleading without studying invisible evidence of failure. Military planning continues to apply Wald's principles. After World War II, analysts study aircraft losses in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. Every analysis includes Wald's fundamental question. What are we not seeing because it did not survive to be examined? But Wald himself does not live to see the full impact of his work. In 1950, he and his wife die in a plane crash in India. He is 48 years old. The irony is not lost on those who knew him. A man who spent years calculating aircraft survivability dies in an aircraft accident. His mathematical papers survive him. His insights become standard curriculum. Students learn about survivor bias without knowing the context of its discovery. The principle becomes abstract, removed from the context of young men dying in burning aircraft over Europe. In the decades after the war, bomber crews hold reunions. They share stories. They remember friends. Some mention the armor that saved them when engines caught fire or cockpits took hits. Few connect these survivals to a mathematician they never met. One veteran, Robert Fraser, the pilot of Lucky Strike, searches for information about the armor modifications in the 1960s. He learns about Wald's role. He writes an article for a veterans magazine explaining how a civilian mathematician saved his life. The article is read by 3,000 people and then forgotten. The principle, however, spreads beyond military applications. Engineers designing cars analyze crash test data. They realize that studying crashed vehicles tells them where cars fail, not where they need to be strengthened. The areas showing no damage in crashes are the areas where improvements matter most. Economists studying financial crises examine successful investors and identify their strategies. But they miss the investors who used identical strategies and lost everything because those investors are bankrupt and no longer appear in data. The visible billionaires are survivors, not representatives of the strategy's true risk. Software developers analyzing bug reports realize that the bugs users report are not necessarily the most critical bugs. Users report bugs they encounter while continuing to use software. Critical bugs that cause immediate crashes prevent users from filing reports. The absence of certain bug reports signals the worst problems. In every case Wald's insight applies. The data you can see is shaped by a selection process. That process hides information. The holes that are present reveal where systems can survive damage. The holes that are absent reveal where systems cannot. 1965. The Vietnam War. American aircraft take heavy losses. Engineers examine returning aircraft and propose armor improvements based on damage patterns. A young analyst remembers reading about Wald's work. He asks, "Are we making the same mistake?" The analysis is revised. Armor is concentrated differently. The change saves lives 30 years after Wald's original insight. 1985. NASA examines data from shuttle heat shield tiles. Some tiles show microfractures after each mission. Engineers propose replacing the damaged tiles more frequently. A statistician asks Wald's question, "What about the tiles that show no damage? Those might be the critical failure points." The analysis is revised. When Columbia disintegrates during re-entry in 2003, investigators confirmed that failure occurred in an area that had shown no previous damage. 2001. Financial analysts study the dot-com crash. They examine companies that survived and identify their common characteristics. A researcher applies Wald's principle. What about the companies that died? The analysis reveals that survivors and failures shared most characteristics. Survival was largely random luck, not superior strategy. The lesson repeats across contexts and decades. Humans are drawn to visible evidence. We study what we can see, touch, measure. We trust data that arrives at our door. We build theories from survivors. And we are consistently misled unless we ask, what are we not seeing? Wald's parents died in the Holocaust. His siblings scattered across the world. His homeland became a memory. He spent the war years in New York calculating probabilities while people he loved were dying in camps. The mathematics he produced saved strangers. It could not save the people who mattered most. This is the complexity that simple stories miss. War creates strange inversions. A refugee mathematician saves the lives of young Americans who bomb cities full of civilians who are not fundamentally different from the mathematician's murdered family. There is no clean moral in this. Only the fact that problems were solved and some lives were saved. Today, Abraham Wald's name appears in statistics textbooks. The survivor bias problem is taught to undergraduates. The principle is abstract now. It demonstrates a fascinating quirk of human cognition, our tendency to overvalue visible evidence and undervalue absent evidence. But in 1943 it was not abstract. It was photographs of bullet holes in aluminum. It was young men burning to death at 25,000 feet. It was a question asked in a room at Columbia University that led to decisions that led to armor plates that stopped bullets that would have killed pilots who returned home to families. The bombers are gone now. Most were scrapped after the war. A few remain in museums, preserved behind ropes. Visitors walk past and see the visible evidence, wings riddled with holes. They imagine the terror of flying through flak. They do not see the absence of holes in the engines, the cockpit, the fuel tanks. They do not see the invisible architecture of decisions based on understanding what matters. The empty spaces that tell a truer story than the damage that survived to be displayed. And they do not know that a mathematician once looked at photographs and asked a question that changed what it meant to come home.